a researcher. I work at Utrecht School of Governance at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. My name is Anne Annink. And the theme of this keynote speech is who is the boss? And the boss is a relational concept. So it's always related to others. You're the boss of others. And I wanted to start with a little exercise for you to get to know the others in this audience. So I want to ask you to introduce yourself to your neighbor, someone who you don't know, so maybe in the front or in the back, by telling him or her who your sport hero is. And this can be an athlete, a trainer, a director, alive, deceased, can be world famous, but also a family member or a friend. So take a few minutes, 2 minutes, to introduce yourself to your neighbor by telling him or her your sport hero.
You need to stand me.
No, I moved the camera.
Okay.
So you need to stand here?
I don't know. The Zoom people couldn't see you.
Oh, okay.
They're like, we can't see you.
I will stay here then.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think maybe you can put it. Yeah, that's fine. This is a slide actually that I don't use.
Oh, yeah. So shall I go back to this now?
Yes, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, you, sorry. You may that's only 1, 2, 3. And who is chosen for a director? That's none of you. Okay. And now I have a question for the men in the audience, so men only. Please stand up again if the answer is yes. Who is chosen for women, a gender neutral or non-binary person as your heroine? It's two, only two. The same question for the women in this audience. Who is chosen for a female heroine, a non-binary or a gender neutral person? Okay, maybe you can have a look around. That's much more. Thank you. You can sit down again. And I have a final question for you all. What did you notice and how can you explain this? So there's one male standing up. And my first question, and many more women choosing a woman. How could you explain this? And we don't need a microphone, so just go ahead.
I guess people relate to people like themselves sometimes, so maybe all women are more like another woman.
Yeah. So the relation to yourself. Another explanation?
I have one. Sport heroes are usually formed in youth. And I think if a male chose a female hero, they would maybe be picked upon for a less than masculine choice, or be outed in some way.
Yeah, it's also because a hero is a status position, and being a male is as well, often unconsciously. So being a man is a higher status than being a woman. So the men, they have to choose someone who is at least a man, plus additional qualities for them to become a hero in their perception. And for the female, this has only be to want a person who has additional qualities, so either male or a female. So who is the boss? It's related to who is a hero, is also a status position. And you could compare this process of selecting your hero to selecting a boss. So the boss is not a neutral concept, like the hero is also not a neutral concept. And this is one of the key themes we would like to discuss with you in this keynote, which Inge, my colleague, will start right now.
Okay. Now, it may be a surprise for you seeing me here and not Maarten van Bottenburgen and Frank van Ekeren, who are announced at the site. My name is Inge Klaringbot, and I'm an associate professor at the Utrecht University. Originally, I am an organizational and policy sociologist, but at the moment I do mainly research on inclusion, diversity, integrity, harassment in sport organizations. Anna and me are part of this Sport and Society group, and we will do the keynote, and I will explain why we do that. When looking at the announcement of the website of the conference, Whose Body Is It? Sport and the Problem of Autonomy, I saw these pictures. The pre-conference panel on gender equality and fairness, the plenary panel, and the rich history of the conference featuring leading and emerging voices in the field. So what do we see? 15 people of white, 15 pictures of white people and one white woman. That is remarkable, isn't it? Although the organizers told me that almost all the chairs of the workshops were women, we do not see them depicted at the site. And I'm convinced that these are, of course, good presenters, but I was surprised, and I discussed the subject with my colleagues. How could we change this image that was painted here, where men were depicted as most influential at the conference, and that the images of women and people of color were missing? We all know the proverb saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. In other words, images are powerful. And that is why we thought we should change this picture. So this is the result. Anna and me changed positions with Maarten and Frank, and now we are standing here doing the keynote, and I hope you will enjoy it. What are we going to do? The idea is to give you some theoretical perspectives closely related to who is the boss, namely leadership and power. The second aspect is to look more closely at dynamics in organizations and societies. And then we will focus specifically on Kanter. She has written about token theory, but mainly about organizations and also leadership and power as part of a social construction. And then Foucault, who goes into the aspect of dominant discourses and discursive practices that are an important aspect of realizing social structures in organizations. And Judith Butler, who wrote about performativity. And then you could translate this to leadership as an act, as something we perform. The point that I want to make in this keynote is that power and leadership are part of social structure that defines who presents or who performs to be the boss, and how these positions of bosses or leadership are discursively legitimized and reproduced within organizations and society. I mainly want to show how leadership and power positions may be seen as an embodied practice within social structures that defines and reproduce who has voice in organizations and society. During the presentation, I will come back to the terms performance and discourses, and I will elaborate on these. When I started thinking about this presentation, the first image that came to my mind was these two ideas. I grew up actually with two ideas on power: survival of the fittest, ascribed to Darwin, and the strategy was the end justifies the means, ascribed to Machiavelli. This represented my father's perspective. He tended to encourage me to be the fittest and to fight and to focus on the end. For example, when coaching me in tennis matches, he wanted me to win no matter how. My mom, however, thought the person I would become is much more important than the ends I reached, and she thought fighting was generally not the best strategy to follow. She encouraged me to play a fair game and develop myself in sport and have fun. I cannot say which is the best, but I realized that gender matters in developing our view on the issue, and that I could learn from both. There are many ideas on about leadership and power, of which I would like to mention two, actually some classical perspectives that I chose quite arbitrarily. Let's start with Max Weber's view on leadership. He defined three ways to become a leader. One way on becoming a leader is traditional leadership. This is based on generative leadership, so from generation to generation, and is based on power of the nobility in society, based on inheritance. For example, you are born to be a king. Rational leadership is based on the idea that efficient bureaucratic organizations need qualified bosses to rule the organization. In other words, leadership requires specific skills, and the one with the best leadership skills would become the boss, if that person applies for the job, of course. From this form of leadership dominates in meritocratic societies. Charismatic leadership is based on personal appearance, based on the fact that people believe in the boss. Then we come to a definition of power. And I relate to Emerson's definition of power. It's quite a simple one, but I think it's good. Emerson emphasizes that one actor's power over another is rooted in the latter's dependence on resources controlled by the former. So, as expressed by Emerson, the power of A over B is equal to and based upon the dependence of B over A. And of course, this is also dependent on how easy it is to reach goals beyond the A-B relationship. So what do we recognize of these aspects of leadership when looking at sport organizations? You will probably recognize Weber's traditional rational leadership in many bureaucratic organizations in the field of sport. For example, when thinking of the many sport federations. And we may tend to solve many problems in sport, also with legislation, with rules, and with institutional control instead of autonomy and care. Let's face an example. Football hooliganism. Let's look at who is the leader or who are the leaders that are involved with this problem? Who are the experts? Whose interests are at stake? And who can solve the issues? Is it the board of the football club? Is it the police? Is it the municipality or the fan club? Or is it all of them? Tackling this problem might be seen as a power struggle, with many leaders taking position in the field. These parties all have their own vision and interests with regards to the sport, the public, cultural values that they convey through sport, and they are at the same time all dependent on each other. This makes the power struggle complex and contextual. Who has the strongest voice and who exerts the most influence or keeps most control over how this problem is treated and governed? So if we want to analyze this problem, we need other perspectives on leadership than Weber and Emerson's. Football hooliganism, but other issues, undermining in sport, harassment and aggressive behavior, social integration, these are all examples that need a more contextualized approach of looking at power positions. For another perspective on leadership and power, I have been inspired by the book of Roosevelt Moss-Kanter already for a long time. I think her approach, which dates back to 1977, deserves more attention when speaking of leadership and power, since I think this perspective is still very useful in contemporary leadership research. Kanter sees leadership and power as part of a social structure. In her book, she describes how social structures operate in a perceptual sense and why it is difficult for people of minority groups to become a boss. She focuses on processes of leadership and power in organization at the meso level, but in my vision, her perspective could be used at the macro or societal level as well. She said power is the ability to get things done, to mobilize resources, to get and use whatever it is that a person needs for the goals he or she is attempting to meet. Kanter defines being the boss or management jobs, leadership positions, as part of a social structure in organizations, and hierarchy and labor differentiations are part of this social structure that define both leadership positions and the positions of employees in the organization. Kanter said that power has a snowball effect. People who are thought to have power and who are well placed in hierarchies of prestige and status are more influential and more effective in getting the people around them to do things and feel satisfied about it. So what she says is that power begets power. And she found that people in higher hierarchical positions are liked more, receive more communication, are talked to more, are less interrupted, and are illuminated as more proficient compared to those not in leadership positions. Too much. Kanter perfectly showed how rules, positions, and images of people in organizations have consequences for the structures and processes in organizations, and how at the same time employees after some years are trapped into spirals of ineffectiveness in the more dead-end jobs that have little or no prospect for further development or promotion. There are, for example, many organizations, of which universities also, that are proud on having a diverse composition of staff, but looking more closely, you can find quite a big group. You can find a big group of people on of color in the lower level jobs and women in administrative jobs or jobs that offer them no further career opportunities. Additionally, this position has consequences for the interactions within organizations. People with less status are more controlled, more questioned, and more overlooked. Puvar says they are seen without being seen. And I like to give you an example of that. In sport for people with an impairment, these people are highly visible, you could say. People tend to look at them because they are different, but they are generally overlooked when it comes to board membership or voluntary positions in the club. Kanter, among others, described that it is difficult for employees to go against their boss. They generally tend to present themselves favorably with regards to the boss, and they prefer to be associated with the more powerful. If you realize that the majority of people tend to leave their job due to the relationship with their boss, it's worth paying attention to the position of these employees and to the position of the leaders. Interesting in her theory is that she described how organizational structures define social interactions as well. The social structure defines who is seen, listened to, and valued within organization, thus who has voice. Kanter elaborated on her idea of power as part of a social structure by differentiating between minority and majority groups or subgroups. She defined token groups or token positions as minority groups which consist of less than 15% of the people. When the minority group contains of 15 to 40% within an organization, she speaks about skewed groups, and between 40 and 60% she speaks of balanced groups. She assumes each composition generates different social interactions and thus different power positions. She describes why tokens face special situation due to the composition of a setting. And I will give you an example. So what do you see here? It's maybe too easy to answer. 1-0, okay. Well, anyone who disagrees? There are many X and 1 O, and you tend to look at the O. So what do you see now? Anyone?
1 O at the top.
1 O at the top. In other words, the O changed position. And how does that work in interaction? She described how that worked, how these structures of minority versus majority groups have impact on the interaction in organizations. She said, well, what is interesting is that you can look at minority groups and majority groups as, for example, her book is called Men and Women in the Organization. So you can translate it to that, but she said this counts for not only for men, for women in minority groups, but these dynamics count for men in minority groups as well, or white versus male and minority groups. Tokens get attention, she said. This creates performance pressure on this token, on this O. We tend to ask to the O, why do you move? Was it per se necessary to move? Is it better there? Do you earn more salary? Why did you make this move? Etc. The focus is on the O. They are seen. Tokens, she said, token contrast. Okay, token contrast and polarize and exaggerate the differences. In uniform groups, people may never become aware of the common culture and type which remains taken for granted within their group and implicit as long as there is no O in the organization, that culture remains the same. But the presence of one O in this group makes that the minority who bear a different set of social characteristics increases the self-consciousness of the X. So on the number, those who are in dominant position, they become aware of the difference from a token and they try to keep the token slightly out. So to give you an example, I don't know if you know Shani Davis. He entered as an elite speed skater, I don't know, 10 years ago maybe. And in Holland, speed skating is a very popular sport. And we were not aware of how wide the sport actually was until Shani Davis entered the speed skating. So there's a tendency to exaggerate the extent of differences between tokens and dominance, and these contrasts may lead to isolation of the token. Then the third point she described was assimilation, how interactions and behavior is influenced by composition is what Kanter called assimilation. Tokens are more easily stereotyped than people found in greater proportions. They therefore tend to conform to the dominant group. So tokens are ironically both highly visible as people who are different, yet not permitted the individuality of their own unique, non-stereotypical characteristics. While in more balanced groups, the group figures, so the stereotypes, became less important and the individual qualities became more visible, but more valued as well. As a result, Kanter states that token leaders tend to lose their leadership position much more easily than if they were not a token. This is called a revolving door effect. So they come in and they turn out again. For example, women in leadership generally tend to leave the organization sooner than men. Based on Kanter's theory, Marlies Ott suggested that the way tokens are treated is not dependent on belonging to a majority or minority group, but more importantly, when a token belongs to a privileged or a marginalized group. In our society, we'll still assume that men are more privileged than women. She compared the careers of men and women with comparable educational backgrounds as tokens within the nursery, a sector dominated by women, and the police, a sector dominated by men. So what happened to the career of a token man in nursery, and what happened to a token woman in the police? Her research is from 1986, but maybe 84. The results were stunning, though. Do you have an idea? The token men in nursery, what happened to them? Although they belonged to the minority group, they became the managers of departments much sooner than their female colleagues, with a comparable level of education. The women in the police who were marginalized and who belonged to the marginalized group and minority were confronted with bullying and sexist images, such as naked women on calendars in the office, or misogynist jokes. They left the organization much sooner than the average man did. So as a token belonging to a privileged group, created completely different interactions and structures in the organizations compared to token belonging to a marginalized group. Ott's research not only showed how careers of men and women differed within the organization, but also how institutional gender meanings impacted upon career path, interactions, organizational dynamics, and who would become the boss. Nowadays, we still tend to ignore these such kind of power dynamics. I have been doing quite some research on the construction of gender in sport-related organizations, specifically at the higher levels of the boards of sport federations in the Netherlands. And what you see here is the blue columns represent the percentage of women of the sport boards during a period of 15 years, from 2002 to 2017. And you see that between 2002, if you focus on the blue columns, there's an increase of the percentage of women between 2002 and 2012 from 10% to 21%. And then it remains almost the same. The red column represents the boards that have no female board member at all. So that decreases quite severe from 53% in 2002 to 21% in 2012 in 10 years, and then it increased again. What we did was that we also interviewed board members to explain this issue, where these patterns came from, and if they wanted to, if they were in for policy to make these boards more equal with regard to the gender balance. And it's striking that there's a widespread assumption that selection procedures in these organizational processes were neutral in the quality, in the sense that they said quality matters, and gender does not play a role in selecting board members. But they just did not apply, and so gender did not play a role. And we found that the board members who are 80% male, there's a clear resistance to the use of policy measures to increase the number of women and minorities in leadership positions. This resistance is based on the meritocratic assumption that selection procedures are neutral, regardless of gender, ethnicity, impairness, or sexual preference. This idea of meritocracy has become normalized as true and fair, and at the same time defends and reinstitutionalized selection procedures for who is going to be the boss. Although these board members drew on this discourse of meritocracy, it has been deconstructed in sport and also in non-sport scholarly literature, for example, by Hoefden, or in sport and out of sport, Castilla and Bernard. And these studies proved how institutional meritocracy almost always turns out to be in favor of the privileged and majority group, which is represented by the white male body. And meritocracy works in favor of the privileged groups, mainly because they define or have defined the selection criteria. And since these are assumed neutral and objective, they count as the norm. Consequently, they reproduce their own power positions. Now, I'd like to continue with this aspect of power dynamics to Foucault. Foucault saw that social structures in society are a product of power positions. Foucault assumed that power is produced in social relations and thus essentially has no negative meaning nor a positive meaning. It is reproduced actually in all institutions, and it shapes institutions without taking on a solid form. Since there's always a certain struggle in institutions on power positions or resistance. Foucault also defined technologies of power, such as social control, rules, habits, judgments, and means of surveillance. These disciplinary techniques focus on the body as the object and the target of power and shapes discipline in the organization and also creates the body as a disciplined or Foucault used the term docile bodies. For example, football is a national sport in the Netherlands and in many countries. But why is that so? Its source probably lies in a dominant national discourse that is quite indefinable. It's everywhere and it's nowhere. We are aware of it, but we don't know where it comes from. And it's distributed and materialized by a large network of social relations, such as fandom, members of football clubs, etc. According to Foucault, these networks reproduce the power and the dominance of football. In other words, social relations in organizations and in societies produce power. Football as a national sport is a product of these relations. In the same line, we see universities and their work and religions as products of power. In other words, it is the daily and incessant relationships between people that produce power. That is what Foucault calls technologies of power. Although Foucault recognized the relationship between discourses and bodily behavior, it was Judith Butler, who elaborated on this issue of embodiment and defined bodily expressions as performances. For example, a man who is wearing a sport skirt in field hockey instead of shorts knows from the dominant discourses that he should wear shorts, but he embodies or he performs something contradictory to the dominant discourse. He will be bullied for wearing skirts, and this bullying is an example of the social control or the technologies of power applied upon him. Butler focused on gender and as a performative act, as an attitude. Butler starts from the premise that gender is not a fixed fact, but instead gender is something always in the process of becoming. Gender is performed as a theater act, we could say. We become gendered bodies through a series of acts which are repeated, renewed, and consolidated through time. So these gendered acts are not neutral. The continuous repetition of these acts over time makes them appear natural, but they are in fact a set of cultural ideas and images of what a real man or a real woman is that we tend to perform. Butler refers to this as the sedimented expectations of gender existence. That has been going on already long before one arrived on the scene. In the same line, we can argue that leadership is an embodied performance. It is learned and trained, it's ritualized, it happens within organizations through history and time, and it became an institutionalized act within the social structures of society and organizations. So leadership is something we learn to perform, and leaders are aware of how to perform power acts. How do we learn what leaders look like? I want to refer to a Dutch documentary. I cannot show you because it's in Dutch, but I will tell you. And it's called White is a Color Too. They did an experiment with 30 children of this age, five years old in the Netherlands. There were children who were white and of color, and they were asked very simple questions to like, who of these children is smartest? And then they had to point at one of the children depicted above, 5 pictures of children with exactly the same clothes and pose, but only their skin colored differed. They asked who of these children is smartest, who is most stupid, who gets the highest grades, who's punished most, who is the naughtiest, and they also asked who is the boss. 75% of these children agreed that white children were smartest, earned the highest grades, and were the boss, while the black children were most stupid, punished most, and were the naughtiest. What we learn from this is that at an incredible early age, we already have rather fixed ideas of which bodies are going to be bosses, and that skin color matters to become a boss. When we translate the outcome of this experiment to sport, we may say that we tend to have comparable images of leaders in sport organizations. These images normalize the white male body as neutral and as the norm for leadership in sport voluntary work, which implies other forms of leadership will generally not be recognized as such. The formation of such sport images and discursive practices often date back to an athlete's own beginning in a sport club, often also at the age of 5 or 6 years old. For example, boys in the Netherlands start playing football at a young age, and since this is the most popular men's sport, a majority of all boys in the Netherlands have been member of a football club for at least 1 year, and generally more or a lot more. This means that dominant and glorified forms of masculinity and leadership that are done in football have a huge impact on these boys who tend to imitate performances. So we may conclude that athletes are disciplined into images and discourses that normalize the absence of women, people of color, people with impairment from positions of leadership. I'd like to elaborate a bit more on this. These are presidents of international sport federations. I started with looking at the presidents of balanced sports or more female sports. So I looked at swimming, equestrian sports, gymnastics, dancing, tennis, hockey, and finally, when I looked at curling, I found the first female president. These are from top left to right and then down. Thomas Bach from the IOC, Murray Kessler, equestrian sports, Sebastian Coe, athletics, Leandro Legre, hockey, Sean Tay, World Dance Sport Federation, Hussein Al-Mustalam in Swimming Federation, Kim Ye-Yul from the ICU, skating, then Kate Caithness from the Curling Federation, David Haggerty, tennis, and Morinari Watanabe from gymnastics. There are 95 presidents of international federations, and how many are women? More than one? Yes, more than one. More than two? Who thinks more than two? Okay, do you want to bet on this?
Who am I betting against?
No, not against.
One over?
Okay.
Yes, 7.
7, okay.
Yeah.
Who guesses more than 7? Who dares? And then who thinks it's less than 7? So there's a lot of people who don't know. What are you doubting about?
We're confused.
You're confused, okay. It's 4 altogether. And I will tell you which sports. So curling, sledge dog running, world underwater sports, and netball. Returning to the physical images of board members, we found that board members who recruit new board members tend to select those who have similar qualifications as they have. Pivot calls this social clooning. This refers to the exercise we just did with Anne. Roos and Zanoni argued, other scholars argued that this similarity in performance, and also look at their suits, they have wear conform clothes, adds to the assumed trustworthiness of these people, of these new and also in selection procedures, this confirms the trustworthiness of new members, which amplified the reproduction of white men being the boss. Uniformity in appearance of bosses leads to recognizability of bosses and as a result to efficient power exertion. In other words, if the boss is generally a man, a white man, we tend to associate bosses with white men, and consequently, people are more likely to select and listen to them. These images and discourses of leadership might contribute to the idea of men and women, white and black, impaired or not, assume that white men are naturally more qualified and better leaders than women, black people, or impaired people. Yet these white male leaders tend not to see the normativity of their own position, which is therefore able to pass as neutral and universal. This denial of gender and race implies that to select a different body than the white male body for leadership positions is generally seen as a risk. Is this person capable of leading? Think of the figures of Cantor with the O's and the X's. Pivot calls this the burden of doubt that minorities face. Isn't it a risk to take this person as a leader? This is an old painting. It's hanging in the States Museum in Amsterdam. And it's a picture of shooters in the 17th century. And I like to show you this famous painting. By trying to see what happens here, I intend to show you how the elements of performance discourses and social structures come together. Leadership and power dynamics may be seen as part of these elements. So what do you see? I'm not going to wait that long. Huh? You see, okay, I'll tell you what you see. You see the shooters. It was not until a black museum curator was looking at the painting that someone first paid attention to the black boy in the middle. This does not mean that the white curators of the museum were stupid, but it means that being white or black matters to what we see. What position does the black boy have? His face is hardly visible. He's probably a slave. What do you think his interests may be? Probably to be free. Here you see that interests we are after are not neutral, but always connect to our body, and to the social position that this body takes in society. Who can best represent the interests of this boy to change his position, for example, as a slave? Is it the boy himself? Probably not. Although to be free from slavery is probably in his interest, he does not have the power to change the situation. The white man in the front, he is probably the most powerful and has influence, yet it's not in his interest to change the boy's position. Or he might even be scared to change the boy's position, even if he thinks he deserves it. The fear of this white man goes far beyond the interests of this only boy. When he would give power to the boy, his fear is that all Black people want to become free, which would mean that the whole society would change, including his own position of power and richness. Now think of what would happen if only one of these shooters would have been Black. And does it matter if a Black man has the position of a slave or the position of a shooter? Probably the slave is more threatening position for the shooters, because as a shooter, a Black man represents a position of the traditional power system. What I try to make clear is that interests are always linked to social power positions, to a performance and to a language and voice. And power positions are linked to gender, ethnicity, and to those who are marginalized. This Black boy is not a boss and will probably not become a boss. He has learned to be marginalized. And it's not easy to unlearn this ingrained position. Then he needs not only training on shooting, but more importantly, he should learn to use the imperial language and the imperial attitude. Which clothes should he wear? What should he do? And what should he do not? How should he talk? And with whom should he be friends? At the same time, he will probably understand that the position as a shooter will be very different for a Black man to fulfill than for a white man, because of his visibility, because of the way he is treated by white people. This is what Puvar calls a collision of scripts. The script of a Black man collides with the script of a leader. While this is no issue for the white man. Now look at the other boy. He is white and his clothes and attitude betrays that he will become a boss in the future. Our reactions to different situations in this painting are based on dominant discursive practices. And if we look at these dominant discursive practices, it appears that there is little place for change and discussion. Taking a different position is not easy. There are many examples of athletes whose careers were ruined when using their voice and body to go against the ruling power. In this context, I just want to mention Peng Shuai. These are two really recent examples. The Chinese tennis star who accused the vice president of China of sexual harassment and rape. Some month ago, she disappeared from the screen, and after a while, she let us know that she needed a rest. The other person you see is Colin Kaepernick, from American football quarterback, and he knelt during the 2016 during the national anthem at the start of the NFL games in protest of police brutality and racial inequality in the United States. And after this season, no club wanted him to give another contract. And in the past, of course, we have examples too. Toby Smith and John Carlos are probably most well-known people. They won a golden and silver medal in the 200-meter running on the 1968 Olympics. And during the medal ceremony in Mexico City, they brought the Black Power salute by raising a black gloved fist. during the playing of the national anthem. They received blame and shame severely, and their careers ended immediately. And suppose what it means if you've trained so much during years to reach this level of sport. These people used their voices as change agents. They made an important point to make society more equitable. It's very hard to do so and to stand up and use your voice because there are risks involved. These people's careers were ruined by standing up. We have come to the end of this presentation, and I would like to do a last exercise with you, or you like to do a last exercise with us to let you experience what it means to stand up and use your voice to present yourself. When do we actually do such a thing, and how does it feel? I want to give the floor to Anna.
Yeah, so a final exercise to experience different power positions and also standing up from those power positions. And in this exercise, standing up is similar to using your voice. Please notice while doing this exercise your own power position in relation to the positions of the others. So you may look around and especially pay attention to how you feel in this power position. So please make sure that you're able to stand up easily, because I have 10 more questions for you, which you may answer if the answer for you is yes, by standing up again. So make sure that bags and anything is removed, it's in the way. And also please know that lying is allowed in this exercise, if this makes you make you feel more comfortable. However, it's not allowed to ask any questions or make any comments, because we will do that at the end of this exercise. So are you ready? Yeah, I have 10 questions. So this is my first questions. Who of you does not play any sports or exercise yourself? Second one, did you come to this conference by plane? Please be aware of your own position compared to that of others and how you feel. Okay, thank you. You may sit down again. Third question. Are you older than 65 years?
I stood up.
I wonder how you felt, but that will be after this exercise. Fourth, who of you has not been vaccinated against corona? 5, who of you does have a chronic disease? Thank you. 6, who of you is affiliated with a church? Thank you. 7, who of you has ever lied? Is there anyone sitting? No? Okay. Maybe this one then. 8, who has stolen something? Oh, there's still some person sitting here. Thank you. Number 9, who has cheated on his or her partner? Very honest audience, thank you. Number 10, who of you is a boss? Thank you. So please be aware a little moment of how it felt for you, this exercise. And I have a question for you all. What did you experience when you knew that your answer would be part of the minority? So you were thinking about your answer, and you know, okay, this might be an answer which is.
Apprehension.
Sorry?
Apprehension.
Thank you.
I think I'm always a part of the minority in any situation, so it just felt wrong.
And did it matter? Was there a difference in between the questions?
Not necessarily, even the chronic disease one, it's like, usually that comes up as a part of the ways in which we like walk in the world, and now we talk about it more often, and so it's like, this is a part that comes with me, and it's a minority for most people, but it's a majority of my life, so.
And how does that feel for you?
It actually feels pretty empowering to
Yeah?
be able to say that.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. And for those who were in the minority, oh, sorry. Yeah.
Mine was
Yeah.
inevitability. I mean, I looked around at the first section this morning, and I didn't know we were going to ask that question, but.
You were allowed to lie, however.
Right.
Yeah. But how did you feel?
Fine.
Fine.
I mean,
Okay.
proud, I guess.
Okay. Okay. And for those who were in the minority at some questions at some point, how did you feel standing up, being in the minority? Yeah, please.
I think like Tiara said, like with the chronic disease one and other things, a lot of the time for like in a social setting, it is a minority, but a lot of the time it becomes the central point of your identity as a piece of empowerment. So for me, it felt similar to Tiara, like it's normal, like it's kind of an everyday thing. So it didn't feel out of the norm.
And has it always felt like that? Also when you were younger, for example, or maybe 10 years ago?
I mean, definitely when I was younger, I felt more like I was an outsider or like I was isolated. But I think now over the years, I've come to terms with it, and I'm more comfortable and accepting it because it is the way it is.
Yeah.
And so. Yeah.
Could you remember or describe to us how it felt to be isolated or in the minority?
I think, like if we think about, as a kid, I had really bad eczema, so my skin was really bad. So, like a lot of the other kids would, you know, they would say that I was contagious, which I wasn't. So like a lot of that is, you know, it was what you would feel and expect as a child, like if you felt victimized, if you felt small. So yeah, I think it's something that I kind of lived with and dealt with. So
yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yes, please.
For me, it is like I just want to live a day in my life, and that I cannot for 7 years now, that I'm not remember that I have a chronic disease. And so this question is like always a reminder that you're not healthy, and healthy should be the first thing that you are in your world. And with Corona, I think many people are aware that healthy is not something that is just there. It can happen to everyone. So that was good in my behalf. But I just want to live like one day you're not sick. You don't have to take pills every day. You have to wake up in the morning, eat, and then take your pills and be there. Because it's the first concern.
Yeah.
Even when you're not concerned about anything, you're concerned about this.
So also the wording creates almost minority or minority feelings, right, for you. Yeah. If we translate this to organizations, what could leaders do to invite employees to who are in the minority to stand up and use their voice? What could they do?
Empower their employees as leaders
And how could they do that?
by creating more opportunities for them and more leadership opportunities.
I think it's also about actually listening though, because like I said, I'm a minority ever since, or as the world sees it, social. And so I'm already talking. I'm already in that sense of empowerment. You just have to listen. You have to be willing to hear what is said. And so it goes back to that tokenization thing too. It's not about having someone there. It's about the table being created for that person to rise, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Every time we come to these conferences, like with my colleague, we've been to a couple of conferences recently, and I'll always be like, there'll be very few black people at these conferences. It's very, as you know, like it's very, very rare. So it's just about not letting that inhibit the fact that at least you can have a voice at these things. We went to a conference last week in Cyprus, and what happened was the only person or two, one was big, and one black female out of 50, 60 people.
And what makes you feel comfortable to stand up and use your voice in these contexts?
My position, it's the same as everyone else's.
Yeah, yeah.
As a lecturer professor, so
yeah.
Why should I
yeah.
why should I see
yeah. So why did we do this exercise? It's to let you experience that it's not easy standing up and using your voice, being in the minority. So we also tend to adopt to the majority. This is how discursive discourses work. They suppress the minority voices. So for example, if you're not vaccinated against corona and you know that everyone else is, you tend to be silent about it, at least to be silent about it. So this is also where the boss comes in. It requires a safe environment for the minorities to use their voice. And this is where bosses can play a very important role. So how do you act when a minority wants to raise his or her voice? What do you do while you're the boss being in the majority? So bosses need to create autonomy, as we just heard. And in this way, the leaders, they do not create followers, but more leaders. Thank you.
Oh yeah, this was the exercise. Okay, just to conclude this keynote, we have done quite a lot of things, I think. We started with giving you some definitions on bosses, on leadership, on power, and we then moved to the perspectives that bosses are part of the social structure. For example, bosses have an essential role in the construction of hierarchical organizations in networks or societies and vice versa. These social structures value some people above others and create and prescribe patterns of interaction. And finally, I hope to have convinced you that power dynamics the power dynamics that inevitably underlie this hierarchical social structure are inseparable from and interwoven with gender, race, sexuality, impairment, or marginalized group. And that is the end. And I don't want to, like to salute, to invite you to also tomorrow's presentation here at the auditorium at 9:15. And where we will continue the discussion on leadership and power and bosses, but then related to specific cases. Thank you very much.
We do have 15 minutes. Are you open to take some questions? Sure. I think we can, because we yesterday had also conversation about some of the topics that you have raised, and I think, yeah, maybe it'd be good to open. We have 15 minutes time. So.
Or people that maybe, if you don't have specific questions, you like to react on what you heard, something that you recognize from your own position or surrounding, or I would like to hear that too. So. Or things that stroke you, or that you're puzzling about, or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine's just a small one, just on that little snippet. Just on the international federations, because that's the area I work. You missed Marisol, the triathlon president, so that's fine. So that's
triathlon. International Federation.
Okay. Yeah, but no, well, ISFs, the governance is terrible. So there's no skills matrix largely. There's no term limits. So every element of good governance is poor. A lot of the leaders have been there for 20 years, 30 years. Yeah. Some of them have just changed. So I think some of those governance pieces will really help with the equity piece as well. As long as you have really bad governance, some of these men will be there for another 20 years.
Yeah.
So it's looking at some of the levers that can help create that as well. And sometimes that's lost and is allowed to be deflected, where I think that leverage and that change will actually bring about a bigger, better outcome.
Yeah, probably. I think also, I've been thinking about what discussion should we then have to about the change of, for example, federation, because it continues to remain the same kind of percentages or so.
There's nobody governing the international federations. So, you know, they stop. There's nobody governing them.
Right.
So it's really member associations and nations stepping up on governance and asking for term limits and all these other things, which the elected don't want. They'll deflect down to smaller items where they don't want to bring in changes that will actually bring about better change. National federations would have much higher governance standards compared to international federations. So, you know, IOC needs to play a bigger role. ASIF just came up with their governance recommendations last week.
Yeah.
They're so light and watered down.
Yeah.
You know, it's poor. So,
yeah.
I
I sometimes also think the arguments on the selection procedures are, in my opinion, not very strong. I mean, you can speak about positive action or those kind of measures, but I think a board of an association should realize what their position is in society and make a decision on how do you want to look and how do you want to represent your sport.
But
that is the main argument, I think, for change. And then you think you cannot say, well, there were no women or people of color who are not applying for the job. No, then we're going to look for them. Yeah.
I think a nominations committee and a skills matrix is the way to do that. Without those mechanisms, it allows committees to be closed. And I think the more transparent and the more open, skills-based, and you've got the right candidates, then I think you'll have great equity. Yeah,
but I mean, if you look at how big these federations are, of course, there's somewhere in the federation there are people of color or people with marginalized people who are qualified. So it's a matter of finding them also, I think. And so that is not an argument that you can't find the right people.
No, right. The lack of transparency stops those people coming forward. So the more transparent and the more documented and the more open, the more those people will step up.
Yeah, I think so too. That's creating the voice. Yeah. Michelle?
Yeah, thank you for this delightful and different keynote, my experience. Yes, but it's quite a risky business to change, because when we think about respectable and trustworthy institutions, some sport federations or organizations, they are respectful and trustworthy, because those organizations, we know from an article that was written by Arjan Boyn and Faryoun about change to remain the same. So respectable, trustworthy organizations are very good in changing, but remaining the same. So if you really change, you're at risk of losing your legitimacy in the environment. So you don't know how other organizations on which you depend are going to react on your change. Yeah. So I think that's a very interesting, but also very complex and difficult organizational and governmental problem to solve.
Yeah.
But maybe there are some suggestions how to trigger or to start that change.
Yeah.
You know, maybe this is sort of related, but still, one of the problems with asking your minority colleagues to take off on leadership is also a title. I don't want to overburden them with having to be the spokesperson for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I need to, and I have to give them time to get tenure and promoted and so on. Mm-hmm. So you have to have that conversation. What is, I don't want to put you on every committee to deal with that and So it's a difficult conversation to balance their need for their own work with taking on leadership on these issues.
Yes.
Well, you can't just view leadership as just diversity, equity, and inclusion for people who are minorities as well. And I think that that's a part that, you know, and I'm thankful you brought that up, because I think that that's a huge part, especially in academia.
Yeah.
We talk about academic, you know, bodies and organizations. It's like people of color, you know, women, people with disabilities, you know, LGBTQIA, so forth and so on, have other skills that aren't just specific to diversity, inclusion,
Right.
and equity. And so we have to look at other bodies that they can represent that are closer to the work that they do, as a part of pushing, you know, their own CV and so forth and so on. That's just.
I agree. I was also thinking that what we saw in this picture of this black boy, I think that it's also so, because often what I heard in my own research was that, for example, women did not apply, or you have to ask women to become a board member or take a leadership position. And it's so important to recognize that we have learned to be different in a way also. So to be asked is makes you think. I mean, I know it. I know it from my own experience that when I was asked for a board membership, then I started thinking about taking this board membership. But I was not used to taking the position also. So that's something you have to sort of learn. While, for example, in football organizations, it's often men standing standing up immediately because they are so interested in football that they want to become a board member. So that's also, I think, a difference in how you were socialized in these things. And you can unlearn it. I mean, that's no problem. I don't want to state this as a fixed thing, but you must become aware of it first. Yeah.
I have a question based on a slide you had with I think it was 5 children. And you had the children responding to, I think it was 5 questions about smart and trouble and bosses and things like that. Maybe it was the contrast, and sometimes it happens with projectors and stuff like that. But was it a straight line in terms of the whitest kid?
Yeah.
The almost albino kid on the left?
Yeah.
Seemed like he was the okay, that's interesting. And the further we went to the right, the more problematic that image was.
Yes. So
it's a straight line in terms of that, right? Or were they asked to grade, where it was just you pick one child?
Yeah, pick one child. That was the question.
Okay.
Which of these children is naughty, or who of these children will become boss?
Okay.
Those kind of questions.
Okay.
And then they only had 2 points.
So the absolute whitest was seen as the
that's or the whitest 2.
Yeah. Okay.
But that was really striking experience. And they also interviewed the parents of these children, and they were even as struck they felt embarrassed about the answers of their own children, because they thought that they had taught them that skin color did not matter, referring to the, so they were more or less politically left-wing parents. So it's that we ignore to discuss this issue with our children, because we don't want them to get racist ideas or something. But by ignoring it, I mean, they learn it anyhow. So you better speak with it about this issue with your children.
So to dig into the study a little bit further, the racialized children, were they also coming up with the same outcomes as the?
Yes, that was stunning too. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, so thank you again for your presentation. And I have a epistemological question. You know, so often the sources we use to critique the structures that you talk about are the people that created the system of those structures. You know, so you source Weber, Foucault, and even Butler to a certain extent. These are all Western epistemologies. And so as researchers, how do we, do you have any ideas, or this is an open question that I think we all grapple with, is that the citations and the sources and the paradigms that we bring in to critique the system, and some way necessarily outside,
I must be honest that I used implicitly also theories of positionality of Patricia Hill Collins. She's a Black scientist, but about positioning and embodiment. But it was more. I'm
just talking more broadly. I'm not so much saying to your presentation, but even these are scholars that have been raised in systems where Western ontologies are the dominant discourse. So, I grapple with that when I look at, citation lists and ways that we look of, dismantling oppression with the same kinds of ideas that are inside those logics.
That's, I think so. I agree with you.
And I think we should conclude the session here. Everyone looks a bit tired, but I just been told the coffee is a little bit late, so sorry about that. But two things. First of all, now Martin and Frank will be dissatisfied that they switched to Keynote because I don't think they get a present here. Thank you again to Anna. And if you refresh your program, though, online, that's the beauty of having a digital program. You can change things very, very quickly. But so we will have a half an hour break now, actually, like 50 minutes, but half an hour until 2:45. And then we'll be back here for 2 talks about books and book series. And then we'll have the final parallel session following that. And the coffee will hopefully arrive during the break at some point. So.